Despite the controversy and disregarding issues of piracy, who here still likes to emulate games? I definitely do. To me, I think what you can do with simple emulation usually outweighs a lot of problems that come with the original hardware. My biggest problem is the amount of money it costs to get some old consoles to look good on your new TV. And I know that people will tell me to play old games on a CRT, but some of us really don't have the space for that. Even then, I personally love the sharp pixel look over scanlines. However, it's pretty hard to get an easy setup for emulators. I've always had trouble hooking up my good computer to my TV, and even then I wish the setup gave me more options. So for a while I've been looking for a good emulation machine. A device I can just plug in and play all of my retro game consoles on. There are a few plug-and-play options, like the classic NES, but it has limited games and its TV and controller settings are limited. I've considered the Retron 5, but it's laggy and you actually have to have the games in the system. I like the idea of just throwing all my ROMs in the machine and being done with it. Plus, there are some games I've had taken from me or I have digitally that I would still like to play on my machine. The Ouya was somewhat advertised as an emulation machine, but it sold horribly and it's out of production now. So what other choices do people like me have? Well, it can be a little bit more hands-on, but a very nice option is the Raspberry Pi. More importantly, the Raspberry Pi installed with the RetroPie using the Emulation Station interface. And that's what we're going to look at today. Just a quick note, I won't be going over how to install the RetroPie in this video. I mostly want to show you guys what this thing can play and how efficient it is, just so maybe some of you may consider buying this device for yourself. I recommend you search on Google or YouTube if you're looking for installation. If you guys really want me to go over installation, I might consider it for a future video. So to people who don't know a lot about the Raspberry Pi, let me give you the lowdown. If you don't really care about that, click here and you can get straight to the review. The Pi, and yes, that's 3.14 because we're fucking nerds, is one of the smallest computers you can buy and it's pretty damn cheap. It runs Raspbian, which is a Debian-based Linux operating system. I don't know much about Linux, I know it's good for servers and it's free. The Pi is mostly a programmer's paradise, and people do plenty of different things with it and its large collection of accessories. And for us, that's going to be installing RetroPie onto this device to use emulators. Now, it's also important to note that there are plenty of different versions of the Pi. As this video comes out, we are up to Raspberry Pi 3 in raw power. So depending on what emulators you want to use, what Raspberry Pi you get may be important. I got the RetroPie for the Pi 1 Model B I had lying around. I wasn't impressed though. It ran NES to Genesis pretty well, but the Super Nintendo wasn't its best friend and Game Boy Advance didn't work at all. It doesn't help that with my setup I wasn't getting sound at first and that took a while to fix. So with all of that, I honestly shelved it. The RetroPie was nice, but not what I really cared for. Now, I specifically got the Pi 3 for the RetroPie. I really wanted my emulation machine, and since I have an Elgato now, I figured it might make recording old games easier. So for this review, I will be assuming you're using the RetroPie 4.2 on the Raspberry Pi 3. Let's hope that extra power does something. That should be a good overview to give you guys an idea of what I'm working with. So let's get this review started. Once you boot up the system, you'll get to the Emulation Station interface. It will first ask you to map the buttons to whatever controller or keyboard you have plugged in. This is actually better than you think. You set up every new controller once and it saves the settings. You can easily change it under the start menu as well. The best part is that this setup is good for every LR emulator, which is all but the Nintendo 64 for me. So unlike computer emulators, you don't have to set up your controller each time. Since we're also using Emulation Station, you can access everything just using your controller, which is a great convenience. On your first boot up, you will get only the RetroPie to select. And here is a selection of menus where you can get in and mess with the files and change a few things. The most important to you guys will probably be the Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, File Manager, and Configuration. Now remember that this isn't the easiest system to work around, and if you're having sound or sizing issues, you'll have to edit the config file. That may be a pain to figure out, so I'll put in the description the easiest way to do that on the RetroPie. Since we're getting into the ROMs and emulators, it's time for the disclaimer. Legally, emulators and dumping your ROMs for archiving is considered fair game. The distribution of ROMs is considered illegal, however. Some argue whether obtaining a copy of a game you already own is illegal. Others argue if it's even illegal to play ROMs that you dumped yourself. At the end of the day, these are all legal gray areas and will probably stay that way for a while. Most companies aren't going to get after you for downloading a ROM, and to my knowledge, it's never happened within the video game industry. The fact is, the most of these games are in the company's backlog. If they're going to go after people, it's the distributor of the ROMs, not us. There's also a moral argument to this whole thing, which is a video in its own right. All I'm going to say is I recommend you own a game physically or digitally if you're going to emulate it. Alright you guys, you've had to wait a while, but finally we're here at the emulators. I'm going to do my best to look at a wide variety of emulators and how games run on them. I'm also going to start with emulators that are easy to get working and work up to ones that will take some more setup. Do note there are more emulators for the Pi than I'm showing. These were just the ones I cared to show that I felt were either popular, complicated to work, or tested the Pi's strength. If you want to see every emulator, go to the RetroPie website yourself. Don't get your hopes up for anything past PlayStation 2 though. I will break up the emulators into 3 sections. Easiest to set up, basically just drag and drop your ROMs into the right folder. Emulators that need more things to download, basically just adding the BIOS files. And the more annoying, which is how to get CD games to work. Every system won't be getting the same time as each other as well. After we cover the basics on some of these emulators, the rest are just self-explanatory. Does it have slowdown, or looking at unique games that could break the emulator? This is where I would tell you to click the annotation if you want to skip to a console you like. However, I had to re-upload this video thanks to a copyright claim, and YouTube doesn't have annotations anymore, so this screen is kind of pointless now. Timestamps are still in the description though. Most emulators are actually already built into the Pi, and these ones will be the easiest to work. Just throw your games into the right folders and bam! These will be good to go. If you somehow get this far and don't know how to do that, I recommend you look up how to do it with the CyberDuck program for your normal computer. With this, you can literally drag, drop, and edit the files from your computer and just wait for your internet to download it to the Pi. First up, why not the NES? The entertainment system that revived the American gaming market. The NES runs great as expected. Every game I threw at it worked like a charm. Super Mario Bros. Worked like it should, and I didn't see any issues on games like Mega Man 6 or Little Samson, which are later NES titles. I ran an IPS patch on my Earthbound Zero ROM which changes some odd text, like state to stats. It put back graphical changes from the game that were taken out in localization. Most of all, it quadruples the experience and doubles money while also cutting the encounter rate by half. And it works like a charm on the Pi. No reason why it wouldn't, but it's always good to test these things. After that, I had one last test. Famicom games also run in the NES folder, which I tried with the Japanese version of Castlevania 3. I not only tried this game because it's a Famicom game, but because I wanted to see if the music was changed for it. The Famicom version of this game had an extra chip which helped give it more sound channels to work with. This soundtrack is amazing, and it works on the Pi too. You know, I haven't really played too much Castlevania, but I watch people play it all the time. What button do I use for the sub-weapons? Select? No. How about Select B? Oh, shit. Okay, we still need to cover some emulation settings as well. If you press Select B, you reset the game, like me. Select plus Start exits the emulator and brings you back to the RetroPie. If you press Select plus X, you will bring up the Argui menu where you can play with a lot of options, such as save states, controls, video, and much more. If you don't like having your hotkeys for the system where they are, you can change them here. Just know that when you save the controller settings, you are setting them to select plus whatever button you want. A keyboard can also have a shit ton of hotkeys on it while you're using your controller. If you want to keep these settings, you will need to go to Configure and change Save on Exit to On. If not, you'll have to redo this every time. This will only save on one emulator, so these settings, for example, won't change the SNES emulator. Alright, the emulator runs fine and the menus are pretty impressive, but what about more video settings? Honestly, I'm not a real big guy when it comes to the original aspect ratio. I usually like to fill the screen. We'll go into video and settings and you can change the aspect ratio to a ton of different things. I like 16:9, but I know most people hate this kind of stretching, so I'll keep it to the original for this video. If you don't want the whole screen filled, but just a little bit, try 19:14 or 19:12. I recommend you also look at the frame rate. Every game that I've seen should be running around 60 frames here, unless it's a PAL game. If it's not running right, you may want to lower your resolution or turn off VSync for a better performance. There are more video and controller settings along with color palettes and a lot of other things, so look at your own pace and change things how you wish. I think we should hit up the Sega Master System. I've actually never played the Master System at all. However, while doing some cleaning, my dad actually found this Master System. No controllers, video power cables, and no fucking clue where it came from. Free console though. So the emulator runs fine from what I can tell. I checked out Quartet since I watched My Life in Gaming's review of it, and it's pretty fun and runs smoothly. Alex Kidd, which was basically Sega's Master System mascot, was built into most versions of the Master System if you turned on the console without a game in it. Oh shit, that means I'm less of a pirate now. This is definitely a different platformer than Mario. My only issue with it is that Alex is like Luigi when it comes to traction. Is it the emulator maybe? Not much else to say. I give the Master System a Master Pass. So maybe it's time to look at some handhelds. I say we play some Link's Awakening for the original Game Boy. I only just oh god, Spinach Green! Ugh. Quick, switch to a different game. Ugh, it didn't work. Menu, quick! Ugh. God damn it. Ugh. Sorry about that. Alright, for some reason this emulator starts with this fucking color setting. Go into options and change the color palette to either Game Boy Color palettes or grayscale. It's all up to opinion, but I like grayscale. I was hoping for maybe some Super Game Boy options, but I haven't seen anything. So this is Donkey Kong for the Game Boy, which is actually a very unique game. The best way to put it is that it's a souped-up arcade Donkey Kong. While I have to say I suck at this game, from what I can tell, it runs great. Link's Awakening also seems pretty stable, but when I was cutting some grass, I got some slowdown. I'm not sure if that's the emulator or what the Game Boy would actually do. To those confused, emulation, despite running games on much more powerful systems, will still replicate slowdown that was present on the original hardware. It is possible to change settings in some emulators to fix this, but that could come packaged with different bugs depending on the game. So I'm not sure whose fault this was. I did play Link's Awakening DX on my 3DS and never saw anything like that. I wasn't able to replicate it too, so if slowdown wasn't the emulator, I think the emulation is good. Since we're already on the Game Boy, let's add some color. Seriously. So the color runs fine as well. I tested out the Pokemon trading card game and had no problems. Animations are super smooth and I had no lag. Pokemon Crystal was also pretty nice, however, I swear I heard some lag in the music when encountering Pokemon. Looking over the video, I think I mixed up lag for Sentret's Cry. If you want to see some more Pokemon, my friend Iron Fury is doing a Nuzlocke randomizer of Crystal, and it's getting pretty crazy. I didn't record this for the video too, but I've also been playing Oracle of Seasons on my 8GB SD card, and honestly, I haven't seen any lag while playing through maybe 1/8 of that game, so I'm sure this emulator's pretty solid. And here's the PC Engine, or as we know it in America, the TurboGrafx 16. Now we can't play a Hudson system without first playing some Bomberman. I got this game on the Wii's Virtual Console and haven't touched it much. I enjoyed what I played here and had no issues with performance. However, real story, I thought I was getting into some creepypasta shit. The corner of the screen is supposed to be the level number over Bomberman's head, but on level 1 it looks like Bomberman with no eyes. This seriously freaked me out and I could not bring it up for this review. Eyeless Bomberman watches you sleep. Enough about possessed games though. Instead, let's play some Ninja Spirit, which is considered one of the best games for the system. I can see why too. Great control, multiplying yourself to defeat an onslaught of enemies, and tons of weapons to choose. I did run into some slowdown when using this rope blade thing with 2 other ninjas. Something tells me that's more of the system than the emulation though. From what I can tell, this emulator is good to go. We might have to overclock my Pi to emulate some blast processing. The Sega Genesis, or as it's known everywhere else, the Sega Mega Drive. Here I played, obviously, Sonic the Hedgehog. It ran great, and I didn't see any graphical bugs or speed issues. Seriously though, if the emulator couldn't run this, I don't think it should have run any Genesis game. Now let's skip to Gargoyles. The only reason I decided to check this game is because there was a bug in the original Genesis that some games took advantage of. The Genesis 3 was an alternative model that removed the bug, but sadly made games that took advantage of it unplayable. I wanted to see if Gargoyles worked because of that, and played a decent way into the first level and had no bugs personally. Last but not least, Castlevania Bloodlines, in Japanese. I actually downloaded this game by accident thinking it was Rondo of Blood. But hey, Japanese games work on this emulator too, so no worries. You know, after playing the 3rd game, it's nice to play a Castlevania game with good controls. Unpopular opinion too, I think this game looks better than Castlevania 4. Fight me. Oh, and the game runs fine, and honestly this emulator is great as well. The Genesis does what Nintendo don't. Because he's a fucking child. You guys expect so much out of kids nowadays. Fuck off, Sega, don't talk to me. Now the Game Gear, the first system to be beaten to death by Nintendo's handheld dominance. First, the game to compete with Tetris, Columns. Not going to lie, this was actually a lot of fun. Probably a good first puzzle game, as I suck at most of them, but played this for longer than expected. Tails Adventure. It's basically a very, very, very light Metroidvania game. It runs just fine even with everything on the screen as crazy as it is. I never knew the Game Gear's graphics were this impressive. Last we're going to play Sonic Chaos. I felt a little lag here, so I turned on frame rates for a bit and didn't see anything bad from the emulator. I think that was just me never playing a Game Gear Sonic game before. Sonic just felt odd while being fast in midair. Overall, it's another good emulator if you want Game Gear games on the big screen. Quick question too, besides compilation packs, is there any way to play Game Gear games on the big screen with the original cartridges? Now time to check the Pi 3's Superpower. The SNES emulator ran everything it couldn't before on my first Pi. I played the first levels in Mario All-Stars from Mario 1, 3, and World. Before I couldn't even control Mario on my Pi 1, but here, all the games work lag-free. Mario World itself was super smooth. Kirby's Dream Land 3, Nintendo's last first-party title on the Super Nintendo, and a damn fine-looking one at that. Sadly, this Kirby game feels a little slow and made me think the game was laggy, but the frame rate doesn't lie, it was perfect. Time to see if the emulator can run extra chips like the NES, and it did no problem with Star Fox. This is my first time really playing Star Fox, but even then, it felt pretty good to me. Glad to see Super Nintendo games run how I want them now. Great emulator. Before we leave this generation, we still need to play life support. Oh, sorry, the Sega 32X. This thing was out less than a year before the Saturn was released, and it's honestly a pretty big failure. The emulation for this gave me my first real bug, too. I only know of Knuckles Chaotix to play, and while selecting characters, the sprites freaked out. I mean, it was pretty good after that, to my knowledge. Who knows what that could do to other games, though, so be cautious with this one and try to work some settings. Now for the biggest reason I got the Pi 3, the Game Boy Advance, along with the best parts of my childhood. As soon as you select the game, keep pressing A until this screen comes up. From here, you can actually change what emulators you use. Now make sure you are not using the GBSP emulator. I'm sorry, but whoever made this emulator read the joystick on a controller over the D-pad? Why? This caused me so much frustration the first time I played. It doesn't make any sense for a 2D handheld, and it just doesn't play right. It's one of the reasons I haven't really used my RetroPie 3 since buying it in July. It wasn't until I found out that changing the emulator fixed this problem that I decided to really get into this device and write this review. Anyway, how does it play? Well, I have played plenty of games that work fine, but I decided to look at Kirby's Amazing Mirror, which showed no problems with either graphics or sound. Mario Tennis also ran perfect, even in the pseudo 3D sections. It even saves properly, which I've had trouble with on my computer on Visual Boy Advance. It's a good emulator. If you want to play Game Boy Advance games on the big screen with this device, get it. It's probably your cheapest method unless the game's on the Wii U. Now before we leave the Game Boy Advance, let's look at some shaders, which are basically filters to make your games look different and more appealing to you. At first, I didn't see anything under shaders, but after some tweaking, I found out you had some options that can do things like scanlines for CRT fans, or high quality 2x, which rounds the pixels to make them look more like pictures. I love using these settings on emulators for my computer, but on most of these ones, they just don't do it for me. I only really tried it on the Game Boy Advance, but they seem kind of offensive. Try to find your own settings, but Super 2X was probably the closest to what I like. This one gives you scanlines. Hell, they even have it look like a tube TV. You also have Virtual Boy graphics? The fuck? Okay, overall, shaders are meh. Maybe you can find ones you like, but for me, it's not that great. Most emulators on computers run these kind of filters better. The Nintendo 64. I really got my hopes up for this thing working, but trust me, it's not the best. Keep in mind this one is not part of the RL emulators and won't use the same settings for your controller as the emulation station. Select plus start should still reset, and select R and L do work as save states, if it doesn't crash. There are no menus though, and no ability to change settings in the config area. How does it look though? Well, the default emulator was pretty awesome. Mario 64 felt perfect. I would love to see some frame rate settings here, but I couldn't activate them to check. Ocarina of Time was also pretty nice, but did have some music lag here and then. Bomberman 64 did not work at all. Mostly black screens, even in the gameplay. It runs slightly better on other emulators, but it's at a snail's pace. Funny enough though, Bomberman the Second Attack fared much better. It did have a lot of slowdown when I used a lot of bombs, so it's not perfect, but it's playable. Donkey Kong 64 and Kirby 64 were also good, despite some minor bugs that didn't really affect gameplay. Pokemon Stadium was extremely slow, and I thought it crashed my Pi for a second. Mario Party 2 seemed playable, though there was this constant black flickering. Mario Golf was filled with some graphical glitches. Lastly, Paper Mario was super slow and had some weird graphical bugs. The 4.2 update is actually pretty damn impressive when it comes to the Nintendo 64. The emulation before, even on the Pi 3, was almost unplayable for me. Here, it's much better, but obviously still not fantastic. My only problem is, I'm not sure about these graphics. There are so many of these jaggies that it's a little off-putting. Is the Pi not using the Nintendo 64 anti-aliasing that is in every game? I don't think it looks horrible, but I feel like the Pi is doing something to help the speed. The Nintendo 64, sadly, should not be a selling point for this device. It lacks major compatibility, can suffer slowdown, and doesn't have the large menu to work with. I wouldn't mind playing Mario and Zelda, maybe even Donkey Kong 64, but most other games just don't work well enough. Maybe on the next Pi model. Oh shit, I should probably talk about these too. I also checked out the Atari 2600 with Space Invaders, and it was weird. There are a lot of buttons on the actual Atari which are mimicked on the controller, and some of them broke the game where I couldn't even fire. Here's Metal Gear 2 for the MXS2, but the emulator covers the MXS1 and 2 with all different versions. The game looks good, but the settings didn't even allow me to look or change controller inputs, and the controller settings didn't let me press start. Meaning I'd be forced to use a keyboard, which in all honesty, that's what you had to use on the actual MSX. Still, I don't see why you can't change the inputs or even use save states. Not sold on the Atari emulator, but the MSX one seems fine, just don't expect to be able to use a controller. Speaking of controls, I should probably talk about the different controllers that work on the RetroPie. I wanted to talk about this earlier, but I figured we should get into the emulators first. There is a wide variety of controllers that are said to work right away with the RetroPie. I tested my PlayStation 3, PlayStation 4, my off-brand PlayStation 3, and my Wii U Pro controller using my wireless adapter. The PlayStation 4 and off-brand PlayStation 3 controller worked perfectly. My actual PlayStation 3 controller didn't work, and I can't tell you why. It's supposed to, but it just wasn't having it. I'm just really confused because my computer can use it just fine. My favorite controller though is the Wii U Pro controller. Call me crazy, but I prefer the button layout, and it just feels perfect in my hands. I love it so much I got this device that lets me use it on my computer, as the USB plug is just for charging. I didn't think it would work on my RetroPie 2, but it does, and that means I can play my games wirelessly. Do note that the PlayStation 3 and PlayStation 4 controller can be hooked up by the right Bluetooth, especially the Pi 3's built-in Bluetooth. However, I didn't bother with it. The official PlayStation 4 USB wireless adapter works on the Pi as well, so if you need other wireless options that are easier to set up, you're good to go. Xbox 360 and One controllers have been said to work right on the get-go too, though I didn't have any to test myself. In all honesty, the amount of controllers that work for this thing is outstanding. I was expecting this to be a big issue when I first looked into the RetroPie, but it's actually pretty damn impressive and easy. Oh, and I recommend you have some keyboard ready to hook up to the Pi when needed. You can use it as a controller or for simple hotkeys, but things like editing config files will require a keyboard. Okay, back to the emulators, and hopefully we stay that way. So that was all the easy emulators to set up. Here you're going to need to download BIOS files and put them into the BIOS folder of the Pi. Basically, these were on the original device that can help the emulator run the games. I'll do my best to explain where to put them, but I won't tell you how to get them. All I did was go to the RetroPie website, or usually just Google RetroPie followed by the system I wanted. This will usually tell you what file you need and what folder it needs to go into. Then you can copy and paste the names into Google to find a place to download them. Don't worry if the actual file has a radically different name, you can just rename the file and put it into the BIOS folder to fix that. I should warn people that like ROMs, BIOS can be considered a legal gray area. I don't honestly know the details, so download at your own risk. I'm sure anything before the PlayStation can be considered fair game. Famous last words. First up, let's tackle the Famicom disk system. This device is basically an add-on for the Famicom. It was like the granddaddy to CD add-ons, but with floppy disks. It allowed the developers to have an easier production and more space for games, with the cost of having load times. You may want to consider playing disk system versions of games like Zelda or Metroid. The extra sound channel, like we heard on the Famicom Castlevania 3, is built into the disk system. A lot of game music that we love, like from Zelda or Metroid, aren't actually the original songs. So maybe you'd like to play these versions and have a different experience. For more on the disk system, I recommend you check out the Gaming Historian's video on it. The BIOS for the system just needs to go into the BIOS folder as well. So I played Metroid, Zelda, and Doki Doki Panic for the emulator, and it worked pretty damn well. I was loving the extra music channel here too. It's just so crazy to hear our old games like this. Now most disk system games had data on both sides of the disk, and you actually have to emulate this. Go into your menu and look up your inputs for ejecting/inserting the disk and flipping the disk. Also note that there are load times before you can flip the disk, so if you see text like this, just wait it out. I recommend you practice flipping the disk on something like Doki Doki Panic, as Side A only has a cutscene before you have to flip for the gameplay. My only gripe with this emulator is that it doesn't tell you what you just did when you press the flip or eject button. The game tells you when you reset save and load save states. So why not this as well? Many times I had no clue as to what side I was on or even if my button worked. This will be your biggest hurdle, but once you get it, then the holy land of an extra sound channel awaits. Let's get into something a little easier now. The Neo-Geo was basically arcade hardware at the cost of being fucking expensive. This was originally $650, and checking inflation, that was $1,200 by 2016 standards. God damn. That's more than my newly built computer, guys. The BIOS are placed different for this system. You don't need to put them into the BIOS folder, but the ROM folder instead. I only tried out King of Fighters 96 for this, and it looks like it was running nice. I didn't have any frame rate issues, which is good for a fighting game, though I'm not good enough at fighting games to really tell. So these next few emulators only need the BIOS and the BIOS folders, but they'll need some extra tweaking as well. We are handling CD games now. Most of the games you download will come in two types of files. The RetroPie actually has to have the file set up so that the game file and the .q file have the same exact name. If not, it either fails to run the games or it doesn't have any sound. The Sega CD was Sega's first attempt at keeping the Genesis going before the Saturn was released. While not a failure in terms of sales, the games usually amounted to horrible FMV games that ended up looking like shit. The only good games for this system were those that decided to take advantage of the extra space for better looking games and fantastic music quality tracks. Though watch out for this and all other CD-based games, you'll see your storage dwindle quickly. Sonic CD was the worst of it, being half a gig, though most other games I looked at were a lot less than that, but still kind of up there. I'd complain more, but Sonic CD. It runs pretty damn near perfect with no performance issues, even the FMVs look nice. Though I see the problem a lot of people had with the game's collision detection. Ew. Stick with the enhanced PC port. I also tried out Popfilmail and it also ran well, even with the voice-acted dialogue. Unless there's just something I don't know about, I think these games are perfectly emulated. Now for the first ever CD add-on, the PC Engine CD / TurboGrafx CD. While a success in Japan, it was a failure in the States, probably from the original system not doing well here either. I would say the best game on the system, and one of the only reasons most of you want to use this emulator, Castlevania Rondo of Blood. Now these files are actually a little bit more difficult to work with. Not only do you need the files to have the same name, but you need to actually edit the .q file with a notepad to change the inside of it to have the same name. Note that you would also put the files in the same spot as you would put the normal PC Engine games. All I played was Rondo of Blood and everything seemed in order. I had some lag each time this monster showed up, but I looked at the frame rate, which said it was alright. No other issues though, not even in the FMV opening or in the music. So if these slowdowns are in order, I call it a pass. Now for the final emulator for today's video, we will be looking at the PlayStation. While not the console I grew up with, it was one of the most successful consoles of all time and had a gigantic range of games to play, especially if you were an RPG fan. As I said, the BIOS for the PlayStation 1 are probably the only ones that might be bad to touch. I can't seem to find anything actually happening, but that's up to you. Gray areas aside, this emulator is pretty amazing. I originally wasn't going to be trying this emulator out because I figured it wasn't going to be good at all. If the Nintendo 64 is shit, then the PlayStation 1 can't be much better, right? Wrong. First, I recommend you go into the config area and change the settings for the PS1 to smooth, or else you're gonna get some dithering. The system also runs through RL, which means video, controller settings, and much more. Hell, even save states work. Spyro looked and played pretty damn well. The frame rate was solid, and I couldn't find any bugs myself. Yu-Gi-Oh! Forbidden Memories had a lot of 2D art that I wasn't sure would show up, but it did. It honestly looks fantastic. I'm probably gonna play it through the Pi when I decide to do my Let's Play down the road. Save states would be a blessing here. Last but not least, Tales of Destiny, the first of the Tales game, and it's so-so for people. It has an FMV opening and a lot of 2D elements I wanted to test. So the emulator honestly runs great with what I tested. It may still not be perfect though. Many PS1 games, especially RPGs, came on multiple discs. I haven't been able to test it myself, but there doesn't seem to be a good way to switch. The Pi has its own hotkey that should do the job, but people still seem to be looking for better methods to do it. I'll try to test this out in the future, but for now I'm giving the PS1 a soft pass. It plays every game I showed here perfectly and with the settings the Nintendo 64 didn't have. Just hope the game you want to play is only on one disc. If you know of an easy solution, please leave a comment. And that's all the emulators I cared to show for the RetroPie. I was honestly surprised how much I got into this. What I thought was going to have plenty of barriers or issues turned out to be universally sound emulation. The only console we really couldn't play was the Nintendo 64. If these other emulators really had bugs or slowdown issues, the games themselves were still relatively playable. Some of you may decide to stick with the original hardware or emulation from official sources. Many others will stick to the unofficial sources for your computers or phones. However, what makes the RetroPie a great emulation machine is the large compatibility and options it comes with. Easy to use video and controller settings that can make it tedious on other devices are nice and organized here. Plus, it's all in this tiny box that can make it easy for travel too. The biggest hurdle will honestly be the way the device is set up and how difficult it can be to change or fix some settings. For the most part though, the internet will guide you through that. Overall, if you need an emulation machine, this will honestly be your best and cheapest option. So I said cheap, but how cheap? Well, the software itself, RetroPie, is free, so there's nothing to pay for there. The Raspberry Pi itself is usually pretty cheap, only coming to around $30 to $40 for the Pi 3. However, I doubt most of you have everything you'll need to run the device, so I recommend a starter kit. These will usually come with a power supply, SD card, HDMI cable, a case for the computer, and a bit more depending on what you want to spend. I do recommend you buy the Pi 3 kits because kits for Pi 1 and 2 usually end up being more expensive for some reason. You may also want to get a decent sized micro SD card that's compatible, especially if you want to play CD-based games. I had a 32GB SanDisk Ultra that would not work for the Pi no matter what I did. My 8GB and 16GB SanDisk, not Ultra, worked fine however. I see some kids with 16GB versions of the Ultra, so it's either the SD card itself, the 32GB version of the Ultra, or the Ultras with the RetroPie and not other operating systems on the Raspberry Pi. Make sure you also have something to read and write to your SD card on your computer. If not, either buy a cheap SD card to USB reader or a kit that has one. The total price of these can vary, but the bare essentials can be found for around $50 with an 8GB SD card. That could be enough for some, but if not, either buy a compatible SD card or buy kits that come with more storage, which can range from $65 to $75. If the whole RetroPie thing doesn't work the way you like, you still have a decent computer that people are doing plenty of different things with. As it stands, this device is cheaper and more reliable than the Retron 5, and especially buying a new console to hack into. For some systems, it's even cheaper than what it cost to get the original hardware to output at a decent quality, let alone the extra hardware to put that signal into. So with the emulation I've tested, options I've showed, and pricing for the Raspberry Pi, it's up to you if this device is worth it. To me, it's not a device I think I'll regret buying. I do hope you guys liked the video and got some good insight on what games work and what games don't, or how to get some emulators to work on the Pi. If there's any specific emulators or functions that made you guys want to purchase the Pi, please leave a comment on what that is. If you want to see the RetroPie in action a bit more, I'll put a list of Let's Plays I've used it on for my channel. That might give you a better idea than just taking my word for it. With that, this is Mike Jr. II, signing out.